My lords, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to talk to you this morning on behalf of Joint Forces Command. And on behalf of Joint Forces Command, I am taking my inspiration from the Ruth. I see myself as lending radiance to them that endured in the heat of the conflict, not least when it hits 33 degrees here tomorrow. So let's try and agree on a couple of things. Let's try and agree on a couple of things. There we go. So, the nature of warfare, well, basically it's a bitch, isn't it? No matter how much euphemistic language and jargon that we may choose to adopt over the centuries, the fact is the nature of warfare doesn't really change, does it? It's hard and unpleasant and brutal and visceral and irrational. At the heart of it, what we do is we threaten to use force or we apply force to folks. And although this may come in many forms, we may be confronting the likes of ISIL in Iraq and Syria, or we may be competing with a difficult Russian proposition across the NATO boundary, or we may be witnessing the evolution of a very nationalistic turn of events in the East and South China Sea. But at the heart of it, warfare always has been and always will be about killing people, smashing their stuff up, and as a result, people being very miserable and disappointed. It can, of course, be done to us. So one of the challenges I think we have to address is if many of us in this room have spent our adult lives prosecuting discretionary operations around the world since the end of the Cold War, we have had the luxury of engaging in professional activity where our business is about an away match, and where harm is not really visited to our homeland, and where our vital national interests have never really been in great jeopardy. And I ask you to think about whether the future going forward, if you look at the strategic horizon, is necessarily going to repeat the comfort of the last 30 years or so. Because it is clear, although the nature of warfare doesn't change, the character of conflict clearly does over time. So you build a castle and you're really pleased with it, and then some idiot turns up with some artillery and spoils your day. You perfect the art of forming the infantry square in really glamorous uniforms, and somebody turns up with a machine gun. You build large conventional armed forces, and then someone invents nuclear weapons and makes a lot of them. And the question I think we have to address in this audience is, what's going to happen next? And my view is, what happens next is that our world, our society, our economy, our domestic life is fundamentally shaped by what we'll call the information age, and it is clearly going to be the case that military capability follows it. And what we need to do is to identify what that means and then do it better than anybody else does, or it'll be done to us. And the sorts of things we're talking about under the strapline of warfare in the information age are shown on this slide here. So there's the easy bit in the left-hand side. You all know about the explosion of processing power because most of you have got it in your pocket. You'll have heard of the Internet of Things, and some of you, the more technically savvy, you'll now be obsessing about how you can turn your bathroom light on when you're still on the train to Andover. That's really just in the foothills of this. You'll have heard of open source big data because you'll have read the advertisements in the Times and the Sunday Times just over this weekend. And you're savvy about social media because you've caught your children using it. So that's the bit that most people get stuck on when they talk about the information age. The bit in the military area that gets less press time, although I think the US, in their conversation about the third offset, is moving up on this, are those other aspects. So let's talk about the military use of space and the opportunities that's going to present to us in terms of communications, bandwidth, but also surveillance in new ways. Let's talk about commercial space. So not very long from now, Google will photograph our planet 6 times a day at 1 meter resolution, and they'll bung it on the internet. Now that might change how we approach the business of ISR in some respect. Sensors will develop. You'll have heard of multispectral sensors, a way that from the sky or from space, you can detect a whole array of things that will be useful, which you can connect to over the internet. Ranges will get longer, precision will get better and more independent. Stealth will improve. That's a constant game, expensive, but constant. And the range of things you can do when a munition reaches the end of its journey will clearly expand. So the first problem in the evolution of land capability is let's think about how we connect the left-hand column to the middle column. What does that give you in terms of the way you do intelligence, planning, command and control, fires, maneuver, logistics? And then let's expand it into the right-hand column, because I think that's just a little bit behind. You'll have heard of robots. You probably think that they are either really technical, and sitting out there somewhere in a big Amazon warehouse is about the limit of it. But if you go to any industrial trade fair now, you will find industry pouring money into autonomous systems and robotics because it works for them, and it's clearly going to work for us. We need to align that with the thought that up until fairly recently, if you bought a really, really expensive precision missile, you felt the need to launch it from a really, really expensive platform. It was quite complicated stuff. But already, and if you want to see the Russian version, it's called Club K, it's an export model, you can get a really, really complex family of missiles in a shipping container, and you just network them. So there's something about the evolution of robotics and autonomous systems and the separation of complex weapons and sensors from complex platforms that will allow us to think about building new forms of capability. And these things should be simple to operate. The hard part was designing and making them. It's not in the firing of them. It's basically as simple as the application of your thumb at some point, either directly or remotely. So the training bill ought to be a lot less than, say, if you remember, trying to hit an aircraft with a javelin, which was basically impossible. So, what is this going to mean? What is this warfare in the information going to mean? Well, let's start with ISR. And when I say ISR, I don't mean a Reaper. I don't mean just an air-breathing thing that takes nice photographs in uncontested airspace. So could we please not obsess about that anymore? What I do mean is, let's start with military space. Geostationary military satellites, nuclear hardened, taking photographs down to maybe 0.6 of a meter resolution, and doing it with things like synthetic aperture radars on a reliable basis. There's just going to be lots of them, and everybody will have them. And then there's commercial space. I mentioned Google, but low Earth orbit satellites, cheap as chips. Lifespan of about 3 years, and they just fall out of the sky, and you pop up some new ones with a range of sensors, including, in the not-too-distant future, synthetic aperture radar. Cheap as chips. Connect that to hybrid air vehicles, sitting at about 70,000 feet, solar-powered, loitering maybe for 3 or 4 months, above the weather, much cheaper than a satellite. And although they take a while to get up there, when they're up there, they can do a whole range of wonderful things for your communications and your surveillance. Then, of course, air-breathing ISR. But let's have a think about how you operate in a world where the enemy does anti-access and area denial really, really well, because we've fallen into the habit of thinking we can go pretty much where we want. Then, of course, on the surface, human intelligence, signals intelligence, technical intelligence, a whole range of sensors. But the bit we need to align it with is this business of open source big data, because layered ISR is going to go from military space, 37,500 kilometers from the Earth, into a big data system that runs on open source. 85% of the intelligence that you use will come from open source. And the people you are going to most want in your headquarters are data scientists who know where to find the data and structure it, people who can analyze that sort of data, people who can turn the data into visualization you as a commander or staff officer can use. And then you're going to need a 20-something to work out how to use that information in a single news cycle, particularly if you're in the business of social media influence. Because, let's be clear, what we have tried to do is to accessorize military operations with a little bit of tinkering in social media. We tried press releases, that didn't really work, and we've tried occasional intrusions into social media, and you're competing with opponents in ISIL and in Russia who do this for a living, who operate on a 20-minute cycle. ISIL does Twitter and Facebook in 23 languages. We barely do it in our own. So if you are fortunate enough, and goodness knows we'd love to be that guy, the commander who is going to run the fight for Mosul, probably the most important thing you want to do as you launch your operation is to get into the minds of the 1 million citizens of Mosul through their computers and their mobile phones, and either tell them the truth, it's going to be a tough day, so move out the way, or tell them a lie if you need them to move somewhere else. We've been doing that for centuries. But this business of social media, linked to open source big data, is going to be at the heart of military operations, which is why I'm a total fan of the Army's evolution of 77 Brigade, and the sooner we can make that work and connect it to the joint space, the happier I will be. In terms of headquarters, you, like me, will have grown up working in the American Leviathan headquarters that were in Iraq, and in some cases are now being reproduced in Iraq. Not unusual to have 3,000 staff and that wonderful life of a Corimek, a gym, a cookhouse that does ice cream every day, a massive headquarters where you're not under any great threat, and IT that works. Terrific, costs millions and millions of dollars, and quite hard to move in a rush. The future is about leaner headquarters based on blade computing and wireless networks which are distributed, so they're very hard to take down, relying on reach back to the major headquarters in the UK and with our NATO partners that will never need to move. That's just a different approach. But show me, O Army, the structure of your future headquarters that's going to take advantage of that technology. Then there's cyber. It's just normal now, isn't it? It's part of the interaction between states and non-states. The bar to entry is really, really low. All you need is a 20-something with a computing degree to have strategic effect. And he can do that in a whole range of languages. So defensive cyber, protecting our networks, normal business, and we're getting better at it. Defensive cyber, protecting your platforms. Many of you are still thinking about that, and there is great vulnerability and great opportunity in the way we could replay it at others. We are starting to see cyber as no longer the silver bullet. We're not going to have a horse tank moment. It's not going to buy out a whole range of capability. It's going to be complementary. And the task for the modern army is how do you integrate cyber into your force protection, your maneuver, your logistics, and into your offensive action. It's just another part of full spectrum targeting. And to do it well, you are going to need the expertise that sits in civil society. That's where the brilliance is. There's nothing novel about it. The thing we haven't had enough of from any of the three services yet are people who think about the military application of cyber, how you take down a military target set. The market leaders is clearly Cybercom in the US, who are doing this well, and the Joint Force Cyber Group, our Joint Force Cyber Group, is learning how to do this. It's inevitably a part of the future. And finally, we have to grapple with the issue of robotics and autonomy. We need to break out of the world where our people and our equipment every year inflate at prices greater than our budget is expected to. So on that basis, ladies and gentlemen, over time, you're going to hire fewer people and buy less stuff. Robotics give us two great advantages, particularly for the Army. First of all, we can develop specialist robots that will de-risk some tough things that people do, perhaps starting in the special forces arena. So if your job is to dismantle a chemical IED, then let's not put the advanced manual techniques operator right next to it. Let's send his avatar or a robot and just distance him from the risk. If you are the guy who's going to be first through the compound breach, or the dog, that's probably a hard place to be. You're going to earn your pay that day. So let's send a machine in first, under control. We're not going to be like North Korea and operate these things independently, at least not yet. But let's develop that. But the advantage to the Army in robotics is how you're going to take military manpower where we are very expensively paying young people to do very simple things at a really high price. So logistics, some aspects of medical care, some aspects of repair. And all you've got to do is to pick up what industry is already thinking about doing and paint it green. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.